Hello and welcome everyone. I hope nobody has a beef with today's video. It would be just awful if anybody had a bone to pick with this recipe. I apologize, those puns were unamusing. Today we're making beef bone broth. Why, you might ask? Simple. Broth is the base of gravy, and without gravy, there would be no poutine. But before we go on a delicious tangent of fries covered in cheese and gravy, let's get back to the topic at hand, beef broth. For today's recipe, you will need 1 kilogram or 2 pounds of beef soup bones, 450 grams or 1 pound of inexpensive beef. Bone-in beef shank is a delightful cut for this. 2 small onions or 1 medium-sized onion, 2 large carrots, 3 stalks of celery, 1 tablespoon of salt. Optionally, you can also add 1 teaspoon of pink peppercorns, 1/2 teaspoon of green peppercorns, and some dried mushrooms that have been rehydrated in 1 cup of hot water for 30 minutes. For this recipe, I will be using an electric pressure cooker, but you can also just simmer everything in a stock pot on the stove. The pressure cooker is just a convenience. It cooks faster and means you don't have to add extra water as the broth cooks. I will also be roasting all of my veggies and beef bones for today's recipe. If you would like a lighter tasting broth, feel free to skip the roasting step. First, we are going to preheat our oven to 375 degrees. Now we need to prep our veggies. I like to peel my carrots so that I can snack on them once they've come out of the broth. Or you could also just wash and scrub them very well. Cut the carrots into large chunks and then do the same with the celery. This ensures that they won't burn when we roast them in the oven. Next, cut the onions into quarters. I like my onions to be peeled so that they can brown better when we roast them. Transfer the carrots, celery, and onions to a roasting vessel of some sort. Then add in the beef bones. Once that is done, set the whole thing into the preheated oven for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes have elapsed, you should have some lightly browned veggies and bones. You can remove them from the oven now, or you can turn everything over and let it brown for another 15 minutes. The longer you roast everything, the stronger the caramelly flavors will be. However, there is also an inherent increase in bitterness. My advice, start with 30 minutes, and if you desire more roasty flavor, try longer in your next batch. Once the roasting is done, we are going to use our optional rehydrated mushrooms and some water to deglaze the roasting pan. I use about 3 cups of liquid total. Near the end of the roasting period, you will also want to sear your beef. I sear mine in a bit of vegetable oil. Getting a nice brown sear on the meat will add a ton of flavor to the broth. Off camera, due to a slight time miscalculation, I added 2 cups of water to the pot after the shank had been seared. Then I scraped the bottom of the pot with a spatula just to loosen up all the tasty browned goodness. Next, carefully add the bones from the roasting pan into the pot. Then dump in the liquid and the veggies. Since I'm using a pressure cooker, I'm going to fill the pot to the maximum pressure cook fill line. If you're doing this in a pot on the stove, simply add water until all of the bones are submerged. Then we can add in the salt and the peppercorns. Now you will want to cook the broth. If you're using an electric pressure cooker like I am, simply switch the weight to the seal setting and set the cook time for 60 minutes. We are going to cook it for 60 minutes and then let it sit for 20 minutes before releasing the pressure. If you're cooking this on a stove, then bring the water to a simmer and cook it until all of the veggies are very soft, the meat pulls apart easily, and the marrow releases from the bones with very little effort. This can take several hours, so be sure to top up the water as it cooks. After the cooking is done, we want to get the broth down to a cool, non-scalding working temperature. I fill my sink with ice and cold water, and then set my pot in it while stirring. This is very effective at removing the heat quickly. While it's cooling, you can remove the beef bones and set them aside. I like to set them in a bowl so that I can pour any broth that drips off them back into the pot later. Once the broth is at a safe handling temperature, we are going to strain it. Since we took the bones out already, the straining process is fairly easy. Just pour it through a strainer into a measuring cup, bowl, or another pot. If your vessel fills up, remove the strainer, dump it into the bone bowl, and then pour off some of the broth into a different vessel. Then continue to strain the rest of the broth. The next step is to do an initial skimming of the fat. I like to do this by taking a ladle and slowly submerging it below the surface of the broth. Don't discard this, as there will be lots of delicious broth caught up in the ladle as well. Simply pour it into a measuring cup and we will recover what we can once it has cooled in the fridge. Once skimmed, transfer the broth into something that you can store in the fridge. I like to use 1 liter or 1 quart canning jars for this. Then pop the broth into the fridge, and don't forget to put the measuring cup with the skimmed fat in the fridge as well. After the broth has fully cooled, the fat will harden to the point that you can remove it fairly easily. If you also want to remove the sediment, simply run the broth through a very fine mesh strainer or through several layers of cheesecloth. You will be left with a delicious beef bone broth that you can use right away or transfer to freezer-safe containers and freeze for use later. And here we have it, the finished beef broth. As you can see, I got about 2.5 liters of broth. The nice thing with the pressure cooker is that you lose very little of the liquid that you put in. That and the fact that you get wonderful broth in a fraction of the time. As alluded to at the start of the video, the broth here is going to be a very crucial part of my upcoming poutine video. So it's fairly safe to call this video Poutine Project Part 1. Now if that piques your curiosity, then be sure to like this video and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next video.